The dust from the departing stagecoach had barely settled when Nora Matthews realized her husband wasn't coming back, leaving her stranded on the unforgiving Wyoming Territory soil with nothing but a 3-month-old baby and a letter explaining he'd found gold fever more enticing than fatherhood. Wyoming Territory, 1878. Nora clutched baby Emma to her chest, shielding the infant's face from the swirling dust as she watched the stagecoach disappear over the horizon. The letter in her trembling hand fluttered in the breeze, threatening to escape, though she'd already memorized its cruel contents. "I can't be the man you need. The gold fields of Montana call to me. Don't try to find me." Charles' tears streamed down her dirt-stained cheeks as the reality of her situation crashed over her. 22 years old, abandoned in a frontier town she'd never set foot in before today, with a hungry baby and barely $5 to her name. Charles had convinced her to leave Pennsylvania to journey west, where he claimed his cousin had secured him work at a sawmill. There was no cousin. There was no job. There had only been Charles's restless spirit and his inability to face the responsibilities of a husband and father. The wind picked up, whipping Nora's faded blue calico dress around her ankles. Emma began to wail, her tiny face reddening with hunger and discomfort. Their trunks sat abandoned beside them, too much for Nora to carry along with her crying child. "Madam." The voice came from behind her, deep and hesitant. Nora turned, startled, to find a tall man atop a chestnut mare. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see a strong jaw covered in several days' growth of beard. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn leather vest, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a summer sky. "You look like you could use some help," he said, swinging down from his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Nora clutched Emma tighter, taking an instinctive step back. She trusted one man, and look where that had gotten her. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice cracking with the obvious lie. The man looked pointedly at her luggage, then back to the empty road, then to the baby crying in her arms. Without another word, he gathered up her trunks, securing them to his horse with practiced efficiency. "Town's 3 miles that way," he said, nodding toward a cluster of buildings barely visible in the distance. "Can't leave you and the little one out here, not with night coming and coyotes prowling." Before Nora could protest further, he'd lifted her and Emma onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then took the reins and began walking beside them toward Timber Creek. "I'm Thomas Ward," he finally said after they'd traveled in silence for several minutes. "Most folks call me Tucker." Nora hesitated, then replied, "Nora Matthews, and this is Emma." The baby had quieted, soothed by the gentle rocking motion of the horse. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Matthews," Tucker said, tipping his hat, "though I wish it were under better circumstances." "How did you know?" Nora asked quietly. Tucker's expression darkened. "Seen it before. Man brings his family out west with big promises, then decides the responsibility's too heavy once they arrive." He glanced up at her. "It ain't right." "No," Nora agreed, her voice barely a whisper. "It isn't." The afternoon sun beat down on them as they made their slow progress toward town. Tucker didn't ask questions, for which Nora was grateful. What could she say? That she'd been naive enough to believe Charles's promises. That she'd ignored her parents' warnings about his character. That she'd chosen poorly and now her daughter would suffer for it. "There's a boarding house in town," Tucker said as they approached the outskirts of Timber Creek. "Widow Jenkins runs it. She's good people. Might have work for you too if you need it." "I need it," Nora said simply. She wouldn't share the final insult that Charles had taken most of their savings for his gold-seeking adventure, leaving her with barely enough for a week's lodging. Tucker nodded. "I figured as much." Timber Creek wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road. A general store, a saloon, a small church, the boarding house Tucker had mentioned, and a scattering of other buildings made up the entire town. People stopped to stare as Tucker led his horse down the main street, Nora and Emma perched uncertainly atop it. Tucker stopped in front of a 2-story white clapboard house with a small sign reading Jenkins Boarding House hanging from the porch. Before Nora could ask how she would manage her trunks, Tucker had already unloaded them and carried them up to the porch. Then he reached up, strong hands spanning her waist, and lifted her down from the horse as if she weighed nothing at all. The door opened to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a curious expression. "Tucker Ward, what have you brought to my doorstep today?" she asked, her gaze moving from Tucker to Nora and the baby. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is Mrs. Matthews and her daughter. They need a place to stay." The older woman's eyes softened as understanding dawned. She'd seen women like Nora before. "Of course they do. Come in, dear, we'll get you settled." Nora turned to Tucker, suddenly aware she had no way to repay his kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Ward. I don't know what we would have done if," he cut her off with a shake of his head. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." But they both knew that wasn't true. "I work at the Taylor Ranch about 5 miles east of town," he said, putting his hat back on. "If you need anything." Nora nodded, unable to find the words. Tucker tipped his hat once more, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. Mrs. Jenkins put a gentle hand on Nora's shoulder. "Come in, child. Let's get you and that baby out of this heat." Nora followed the older woman inside, grateful for the respite but acutely aware that her problems were far from over. The boarding house was clean and modestly furnished. Mrs. Jenkins showed Nora to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. "It's not much," Mrs. Jenkins said apologetically, "but it's clean and quiet." "It's perfect," Nora replied, sitting in the rocker to nurse Emma, who had begun fussing again. "May I ask, how much is the room?" Mrs. Jenkins quoted a price that made Nora's heart sink. Even the modest sum would exhaust her meager funds within a week. "I need work," Nora said directly. "I can cook, clean, sew anything. I'm a quick learner." The older woman studied her thoughtfully. "As it happens, I could use help around here. My arthritis makes it hard to keep up with everything. Room and board in exchange for your help, plus a small wage. Would that suit?" Relief flooded through Nora. "Yes, thank you. Get some rest tonight. We'll talk details in the morning, Mrs. Jenkins paused at the door. "That Tucker Ward who brought you, he's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself, but decent through and through. Works as the foreman at the Taylor place. Best horse trainer in 3 counties. Nora nodded, filing away the information. "He was very kind to help us." After Mrs. Jenkins left, Nora sat in the rocker, gazing down at Emma's face as she nursed. The baby's eyes were growing heavy, her tiny hand curled against Nora's skin. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered, "but we'll be all right, I promise you that." As Emma drifted to sleep, Nora gazed out the window toward the distant hills. The image of a pair of sky-blue eyes beneath the brim of a worn hat came unbidden to her mind. She pushed the thought away. She'd trusted a man once and paid dearly for it. Never again. The next morning, Nora woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town coming to life. Emma was still sleeping, a small miracle Nora was grateful for. She washed quickly with the cold water in the basin, changed into her second dress, faded green calico, nearly as worn as the blue one, and pinned her light brown hair into a simple bun. Mrs. Jenkins was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with gnarled hands. She smiled when she saw Nora. "Good morning, dear. There's coffee on the stove and porridge keeping warm." "Thank you," Nora said, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning, too anxious about Charles's increasingly strange behavior as they'd approached Timber Creek. As she ate, Mrs. Jenkins explained her duties. Nora would help prepare meals for the boarders, currently only 3 men, all workers at the sawmill outside town, clean the rooms, do laundry, and assist with whatever else needed doing. In exchange, she'd have the room, meals, and $2 a week. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A chance to build something from nothing. The days fell into a pattern. Nora woke early, tended to Emma, helped prepare breakfast for the boarders, cleaned rooms, did laundry, prepared lunch, mended linens, helped with dinner, and collapsed into bed each night exhausted but satisfied she was making her way. Mrs. Jenkins, call me Ida, dear, proved to be a godsend, not only as an employer but as a surrogate grandmother to Emma. She would rock the baby while Nora worked, singing old lullabies and telling stories of her own children, long grown and moved away. 2 weeks passed without any sign of Tucker Ward. Nora told herself she wasn't looking for him, wasn't hoping to see that chestnut mare tethered outside the general store or the saloon when she went into town on errands. It was simply that she wanted to properly thank him for his help. It was on a crisp Tuesday morning in early October when she finally saw him again. She was at the general store, selecting fabric to make Emma a new gown. The baby was growing quickly when the bell above the door jingled, and Tucker stepped inside. He looked different in the store's light than he had on the dusty road. Taller somehow, his shoulders broader beneath a clean blue shirt. His face was freshly shaved, revealing a strong jaw and the faint scar that ran along his left cheekbone. His hair, freed from his hat, was the rich brown of turned earth, with strands of gold where the sun had lightened it. He didn't notice her at first, speaking in low tones to Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, about an order of grain for the Taylor ranch. When he did turn and see her, his blue eyes widened slightly in recognition, and he nodded. "Mrs. Matthews, Mr. Ward," she replied, suddenly aware of how quickly her heart was beating. "I'm glad to see you. I wanted to thank you properly for your help that day." Tucker shook his head. "No need, madam. How are you and the little one settling in?" "Well, thank you. Mrs. Jenkins has been very kind. I'm working at the boarding house now." He nodded approvingly. "Good people there." He glanced at the fabric in her hands, making something, a gown for Emma. "She's growing so fast." A small smile touched his lips. "Babies do that." There was an awkward pause before he asked, "And you're managing all right? You and the baby?" Nora straightened her shoulders. "We are, one day at a time." Tucker seemed about to say something more when Mr. Peterson called him back to finalize his order. He tipped his hat to her. "Good day, Mrs. Matthews." "Good day, Mr. Ward." Nora completed her purchases quickly and returned to the boarding house, telling herself the flush in her cheeks was from the brisk autumn air, nothing more. That evening, as she sat by the window sewing Emma's new gown by lamplight, Ida Jenkins settled into the chair across from her with a knowing look. "Saw Tucker Ward in town today," she said casually. "He asked after you." Nora's fingers stilled on the fabric. "Did he, Wanted to know if you were truly settling in all right." Ida's eyes twinkled. "He's a good man, that one, 32 years old and never married, though not for lack of interest from the local girls." "I'm not interested in Mr. Ward or any man," Nora said firmly, resuming her sewing with unnecessary vigor. "Emma and I are managing just fine on our own." Ida's expression softened. "Of course you are, dear, but there's no harm in having friends." Nora said nothing, but later that night, as she lay in bed with Emma sleeping beside her, she wondered about Tucker Ward. What was his story? Why had a man like him, handsome, capable, kind, remained unmarried? And why did the thought of him bring both comfort and unease? She pushed these questions aside. Her focus needed to be on survival, on building a secure future for Emma. There was no room for anything or anyone else. The weeks passed, autumn deepening toward winter. Nora's hands grew rough from washing and scrubbing, but she didn't mind. Each callus was a badge of her independence, her ability to provide for her daughter. Emma thrived, growing plumper and more alert each day. She had Charles's dark eyes, but thankfully little else of him. Her smile, which appeared more and more frequently, was all her own, lighting up her small face and Nora's heart in equal measure. Nora saw Tucker Ward occasionally in town. Their exchanges were brief, polite. He always asked after Emma. Once he brought a small wooden horse he'd carved himself. "For when she's older," he said gruffly, pressing it into Nora's hand before turning away quickly, as if embarrassed by the gesture. Nora kept the toy on the windowsill in their room, sometimes running her fingers over its smooth surface when Emma was asleep. November brought the first snow, transforming Timber Creek into a pristine wonderland that lasted exactly half a day before turning to muddy slush under wagon wheels and boot heels. The boarding house grew busier as traveling salesmen and other wayfarers sought shelter from the increasingly harsh weather. It was during the third week of November, with a bitter wind howling outside, that Emma fell ill. It started with a slight cough that rapidly worsened, her tiny body burning with fever by nightfall. Dr. Wilson, the town's elderly physician, came quickly when summoned. His examination was thorough, but his expression grave. "Lung fever," he pronounced, packing away his stethoscope. "Not uncommon in infants, especially during winter." "But she'll recover?" Nora asked, clutching Emma's hot, limp body to her chest. The doctor hesitated. "Keep her warm, try to get her to take fluids. If the fever breaks within 48 hours, she should pull through. If..." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "I'll be back tomorrow," Dr. Wilson promised, patting Nora's shoulder awkwardly before leaving. Ida stayed with Nora that night, the two women taking turns holding Emma, trying to coax water between her parched lips, applying cool cloths to her burning forehead. By morning, the baby's breathing had grown more labored, each breath a terrible wheeze that tore at Nora's heart. "She needs medicine," Nora said desperately as dawn broke, "something stronger than these home remedies." Ida looked troubled. "Dr. Wilson will be back soon. And if he doesn't have what she needs, the next nearest doctor is in Laramie, 2 days' ride in good weather." "We'll pray it doesn't come to that," Ida said, but her eyes betrayed her worry. Dr. Wilson returned mid-morning, his examination even more somber than before. "The fever's worse. I've given her all I can, but..." "There must be something else," Nora insisted, panic rising in her throat. The doctor hesitated. "There's a medicine and extract that might help, but I don't have any. It would have to come from Laramie." "Then someone needs to go to Laramie," Nora said, her voice flat with determination. "In this weather, it's madness. The pass could be snowed in by now. I don't care. My daughter is dying." The door opened then, admitting a blast of cold air, and Tucker Ward, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. His eyes went immediately to the baby in Nora's arms, taking in her flushed face and labored breathing. "What's happened?" he asked, crossing to them in 2 long strides. Ida quickly explained the situation. Tucker listened, his expression growing more grave with each word. "I'll go," he said simply when she'd finished. "It's too dangerous," Dr. Wilson protested. "The storm's getting worse." Tucker ignored him, focusing instead on Nora. "What's the medicine called?" "Belladonna extract," the doctor answered reluctantly. "But I can't recommend, write it down," Tucker instructed, already removing his snow-covered coat and replacing it with a heavier one hanging by the door one of the boarders, Nora realized. "And anything else she might need." While the doctor complied, Tucker turned to Nora, his blue eyes locked with hers, steady and sure. "I'll be back by tomorrow night. Keep her fighting until then." Nora nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. This man, practically a stranger, was willing to risk his life for her child when Emma's own father had abandoned them both without a backward glance. Tucker tucked the doctor's note into his pocket, pulled on heavy gloves, and moved toward the door. Impulsively, Nora caught his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. His expression softened for a moment, and he covered her hand with his own. "Just keep that little girl alive until I get back." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down Nora's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The next 36 hours were the longest of Nora's life. Emma's condition worsened steadily, her tiny body racked with fever, her breathing growing more labored. Nora barely slept, keeping constant vigil, praying as she hadn't since she was a child. Dr. Wilson came and went, doing what little he could. Ida stayed close, making sure Nora ate and drank, taking Emma occasionally so Nora could rest for a few minutes. As the second evening approached with no sign of Tucker and the storm still raging outside, Nora began to lose hope. What if he couldn't make it through? What if he was lying injured or worse somewhere in the mountains? And even if he did return, would it be in time? Emma had stopped crying hours ago, her strength exhausted. She lay limply in Nora's arms, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin burning to the touch. Nora sat by the window, watching the swirling snow, rocking gently and humming the lullaby her own mother had sung to her as a child. "Please," she whispered, not sure if she was addressing God, Tucker, or Emma herself. "Please." It was well past midnight when she heard the commotion downstairs, boots stomping, voices raised in excitement and concern. Then heavy footsteps on the stairs, and the door burst open to reveal Tucker Ward, snow-covered and haggard but triumphant. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, reaching into his coat to produce a small brown bottle. "The medicine," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "And the doctor from Laramie." Behind him stood a younger man with a medical bag already shrugging out of his snow-crusted coat. What followed was a blur. The Laramie doctor examining Emma, administering the belladonna extract, giving instructions for continued care. Ida hustling Tucker downstairs for hot food and whiskey. And through it all, Nora holding Emma, watching for any sign of improvement, barely daring to hope by dawn the fever had broken. Emma's breathing, while still congested, had lost its terrible wheezing quality. The Laramie doctor pronounced her out of immediate danger, though cautioning that her recovery would be slow. Nora wept then, the tears she'd been holding back for days finally breaking free. Ida took Emma from her arms, settling the sleeping baby in her cradle, and gently pushed Nora toward the door. "Go thank that man properly," she said. "He's in the kitchen." Nora found Tucker slumped at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee before him. He looked utterly spent, his face pale beneath windburn, dark circles under his eyes. He straightened when he saw her. "Emma," he asked immediately, "the fever's broken. The doctor says she'll recover." Nora's voice caught. "Because of you." Tucker shook his head. "I just fetched the medicine." "You rode through a blizzard. You could have died." He looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Couldn't just let her suffer, could I?" Nora moved closer, placing her hand over his where it rested on the table. His skin was warm despite his ordeal, his knuckles scraped and raw. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this for us? You barely know us." Tucker was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on their hands. "My sister," he finally said, his voice low. "She lost her husband in '71, influenza, left her with twin boys, just babies. She wrote asking for help, but by the time her letter reached me, by the time I got there," he swallowed hard. "Too late, all 3 of them gone. The neighbors said no one would help, afraid of catching it themselves." Nora's heart constricted. "I'm so sorry. When I saw you standing there by the road, holding your baby, looking lost but determined, I couldn't ride past, not again." Without thinking, Nora leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek, rough with stubble. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not riding past." Tucker's eyes, when they met hers, held something she wasn't ready to name, something that made her heart beat faster even as it frightened her. She stepped back, suddenly aware of how inappropriate her gesture had been. "You should rest. You must be exhausted." He nodded, rising stiffly from the chair. "I'll check on you and Emma tomorrow if that's all right." "Of course." After he'd gone, Nora returned to her room where Emma slept peacefully in her cradle, her breathing clear for the first time in days. Ida had dozed off in the rocking chair. Nora stood looking down at her daughter, overwhelmed by how close she'd come to losing her, and by the lengths a near stranger had gone to save her. She thought of Charles, who had found his own desires more compelling than his child's welfare, and of Tucker, who had risked his life for that same child without hesitation. Something shifted inside her then, a wall beginning to crumble. Perhaps not all men were like Charles. Perhaps there were men like Tucker Ward in the world, men of honor and kindness, men whose words matched their actions. It was a dangerous thought. But as she watched Emma's peaceful slumber, Nora allowed herself to consider it just the same. True to his word, Tucker returned the next day to check on Emma. He looked better after a night's rest, though still weary around the eyes. Emma, too, was improved, alert enough to focus on the deep voice of their visitor and even offer a small smile. "She likes you," Nora said as Tucker gently touched the baby's cheek with one finger. "Smart girl," he replied with a faint smile of his own. "Takes after her mother." The compliment warmed Nora unexpectedly. She busied herself with straightening Emma's blanket to hide her reaction. "The doctor from Laramie left more medicine," she said, "and instructions. He says she should make a full recovery." "Good." Tucker seemed reluctant to leave, lingering by the cradle. "If you need anything else." "You've done more than enough," Nora assured him. "More than I can ever repay." Tucker's expression grew serious. "I didn't do it for repayment." "I know," Nora said softly. That's what makes it so special. Their eyes met and held for a long moment before Tucker cleared his throat and reached for his hat. I should get back to the ranch, mister. Taylor's been generous about my absence, but there's work waiting, of course. Nora walked him to the door. Thank you again, Mr. Ward. Tucker, he corrected gently. After all this, I think you can call me Tucker. Tucker, she repeated, liking the feel of his name on her lips. Then you must call me Nora. His smile deepened the creases around his eyes. Nora, he said, as if testing it. It suits you. After he'd gone, Nora found herself touching her cheek where his gaze had lingered, a foolish gesture she immediately checked. She wasn't some starry-eyed girl to be swept away by a handsome face and a few kind actions. And yet, as winter settled fully over Timber Creek, Tucker became a regular visitor to the boarding house. He would stop by every few days, always with some small gift, a jar of honey for Emma's cough, a book he thought Nora might enjoy, fresh eggs from the ranch's hens. His visits were brief but regular, a bright spot in the long winter days. Emma adored him, lighting up whenever he entered the room, reaching for him with chubby hands once she was well enough to sit up. Tucker was gentle with her, telling her stories about the horses at the ranch, letting her grasp his fingers in her tiny fists. Watching them together brought an ache to Nora's heart, joy mingled with sorrow for what might have been if Emma's father had been a different sort of man. December brought Christmas preparations to Timber Creek. The boarding house was festooned with pine boughs and red ribbons. Ida insisted on a small tree in the parlor, decorated with paper stars and strings of cranberries. 3 days before Christmas, Tucker arrived with a small pine tree for Nora's room and a carved wooden rattle for Emma. Made it myself, he said almost shyly as Emma immediately put it in her mouth, drooling happily on the smooth wood. Figured she's about ready for one. It's beautiful, Nora said, genuinely touched. You're very talented. Tucker shrugged off the compliment. Just something to do on long evenings, speaking of which. He hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. The Taylor family is having their Christmas gathering tomorrow night. Nothing fancy, just dinner and some singing afterward. They asked me to invite you and Emma. Nora blinked in surprise. Me, but I've never even met them. Mrs. Taylor insists, says any friend of mine is welcome. He shifted his weight, hat in hand. You don't have to come if you don't want to. I know it's short notice and with Emma. I'd like to, Nora said before she could reconsider. If Ida can spare me for the evening. Tucker's face brightened. Really? I'll come fetch you around 5 then. The ranch is too far to walk, especially with the little one. After he'd gone, Nora sat staring at the small pine tree, her mind whirling. Had she just agreed to what amounted to a social engagement with Tucker Ward? What would people think? She was still technically a married woman, even if her husband had abandoned her. But then, no one in Timber Creek knew that. As far as they were concerned, she was a widow, which is how she'd allowed people to perceive her, not correcting their assumptions. The thought brought a flush of shame, but what was the alternative? To admit she'd been abandoned. To face their pity or worse, their judgment, Ida, of course, knew the truth. Nora had confided in her during those terrible hours of Emma's illness. The older woman had been understanding, even sympathetic. Men like your Charles, they're not made for the hard work of love, she'd said. They want the excitement without the responsibility. It's not your fault he couldn't be the man you needed him to be. Now, as Nora considered Tucker's invitation, she sought out Ida for advice. Should I go? She asked after explaining the situation. Would it be improper? Ida's eyes twinkled. Improper to have Christmas dinner with a respected family in the community? Hardly. Besides, that Tucker Ward has been courting you as properly as any man I've ever seen. Courting? Nora sputtered. We're not, maybe not officially, Ida agreed with a knowing smile. But that man doesn't bring wooden rattles to just anyone. He's sweet on you, Nora, and unless I'm much mistaken, you're not entirely indifferent to him either. Nora couldn't deny the flutter in her heart whenever Tucker appeared, or the way she found herself watching for him from the window, or how she took extra care with her appearance on days she thought he might visit. Even if that were true, she said carefully, I'm not free. Charles is still my husband, regardless of his actions. Ida's expression softened. Charles gave up any right to call himself your husband when he abandoned you and Emma. In the eyes of God and any decent person, you're as good as widowed. And after a suitable period of mourning, which I'd say you've more than observed, you're free to find happiness wherever it presents itself. Nora wasn't entirely convinced, but she couldn't deny the yearning in her heart for the kind of partnership she saw between Tucker and herself, a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care. "Wear your green dress," Ida advised as she left. "It brings out the gold in your hair." The next evening, Nora dressed with unusual care. The green dress was her best, saved for Sundays and special occasions. She arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than usual, securing it with her mother's tortoiseshell combs. Emma, too, was dressed in her finest, a white gown Nora had embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots around the collar. Tucker arrived precisely at 5, his chestnut mare hitched to a small sleigh. He had shed his usual work clothes for a clean dark suit and polished boots. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. The sight of him standing in the boarding house doorway, hat in hand, made Nora's heart skip. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his gaze warm as it traveled from her face to her dress and back again. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "So do you. Handsome, I mean." His smile deepened the creases around his eyes in a way Nora found utterly charming. "Got a lady's reputation to think of. Can't have folks saying Tucker Ward doesn't clean up proper when escorting a lady." The sleigh ride to the Taylor Ranch was magical. Tucker had lined the sleigh with warm blankets and heated bricks for their feet. Emma, bundled in layers of wool, sat contentedly on Nora's lap, fascinated by the jingling of the bells on the horse's harness. Snow had fallen the night before, transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland. The setting sun cast long blue shadows across the unmarked drifts. The air was crisp and clean, their breath forming small clouds in the fading light. Tucker pointed out landmarks as they traveled the creek that gave the town its name, now frozen solid. The stand of aspen trees where he'd once tracked a mountain lion, the distant peaks of the Medicine Bow Range, purple against the darkening sky. "It's beautiful," Nora said, drinking in the vast landscape so different from the Pennsylvania farmland of her youth. "It grows on you," Tucker agreed. "Wasn't sure I'd stay when I first came out here in '65, right after the war, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." "You fought in the war?" Nora asked, realizing how little she actually knew about him. Tucker nodded, his expression sobering. "Union cavalry. Enlisted in '63, just turned 17, saw things no boy should see." He glanced at her. "Came west afterward like a lot of us did." "Looking for open spaces and quiet, I guess." Did it help finding the quiet? He considered this. There's a peace to this country once you learn to hear it." They fell silent then, but it was a comfortable silence, broken only by Emma's occasional coos and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the packed snow. The Taylor Ranch was larger than Nora had expected, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, all well-maintained. Warm light spilled from the windows, and the sound of laughter and music reached them as Tucker helped Nora and Emma from the sleigh. "Don't be nervous," he said, accurately reading her expression. "They're good people." The Taylors, James and Margaret, their 3 grown children and various spouses and grandchildren, welcomed Nora and Emma with genuine warmth. If they were curious about her relationship with Tucker, they were too well-mannered to show it. Dinner was a festive affair: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and more dishes than Nora could count, followed by mince pies and a magnificent plum pudding. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and good-natured teasing. Nora found herself seated beside Margaret Taylor, a handsome woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. "Tucker tells me you're working at Ida Jenkins' place," Margaret said as they ate. "Yes, since October," Nora replied. "She's been very kind to Emma and me." "Ida's one of the best," Margaret agreed. "And how are you finding Timber Creek?" "It's becoming home," Nora said, surprised to realize it was true. "The people have been welcoming," Margaret smiled. "It's a good community." Small enough that we look after our own, but not so small that everyone knows your business." She glanced toward Tucker, who was across the table entertaining Emma and one of the Taylor grandchildren with a story. "Tucker speaks very highly of you." Nora felt herself blush. "He's been extraordinarily kind to us. I don't know what we would have done without him." "That's Tucker," Margaret said with obvious affection. "Always been a softie for those in need, though he'd hate to hear me say so." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He's had his share of hard times, you know. Lost his whole family, parents, sister, nephews within a few years. Keeps to himself mostly, except with the horses." Her gaze was knowing. "Until recently, that is." Nora wasn't sure how to respond to the implied question. Fortunately, James Taylor chose that moment to propose a toast, saving her from having to reply. After dinner, they gathered in the parlor. James Taylor played the fiddle while his daughter accompanied him on the piano. There was singing and storytelling, the atmosphere warm and familial in a way that made Nora's throat tight with both longing and gratitude. Emma, passed from lap to lap and thoroughly spoiled with attention, finally fell asleep in Margaret Taylor's arms. "She's beautiful," Margaret said, gently transferring the sleeping baby back to Nora. "You must be very proud." "I am," Nora agreed, stroking Emma's soft cheek. "She's everything to me." "As it should be," Margaret said approvingly. She glanced at Tucker, who was watching them from across the room with an expression that made Nora's heart flutter. Though there's room in a heart for more than one kind of love. The evening ended with reluctant goodbyes and promises to visit again soon. Tucker wrapped Nora and Emma in blankets for the return journey, his hands lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary. The night had cleared, revealing a sky ablaze with stars. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to turn the snow-covered landscape into a silver dream. The only sounds were the horses' steady breathing, the creak of the sleigh runners, and Emma's soft snores from within her cocoon of blankets. "Thank you for coming tonight," Tucker said quietly as they approached the outskirts of town. "Means a lot that you'd trust me with you and Emma." "Thank you for inviting us," Nora replied. "It was wonderful. The Taylors are lovely people. They think the same of you." Tucker hesitated, then added, "Margaret pulled me aside before we left, said you were exactly what this old bachelor needs to settle him properly." Nora laughed softly, though her heart was suddenly racing. "Did she now?" "She's a terrible matchmaker," Tucker said, but there was a smile in his voice. "Been trying to pair me off with every eligible woman in 3 counties for years. And has she succeeded before now?" Nora asked before she could stop herself. Tucker glanced at her, his expression serious despite his light tone. "Hadn't found anyone worth changing my ways for, until recently." The implication hung in the air between them, too significant to be dismissed, too delicate to be addressed directly. Nora looked down at Emma, using the excuse of checking on the baby to gather her thoughts. "Tucker," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the sleigh's movement. "I should tell you something about Emma's father. He was silent, waiting. He didn't die, as everyone assumes. He left us. Abandoned us the day we arrived in Timber Creek." The admission felt both freeing and frightening. He decided gold-seeking was more appealing than being a husband and father. Tucker was quiet for so long that Nora feared she'd misjudged him, that this revelation would change his opinion of her. "I know," he finally said. Nora's head jerked up. "You know, but how?" "Suspected from the beginning. Confirmed it when Jeb at the livery mentioned a fellow matching your husband's description buying a horse the same day you arrived, heading north toward Montana." His jaw tightened. "Considered going after him, making him come back and face his responsibilities." Nora was stunned. "Why didn't you?" Tucker's gaze met hers, steady and clear in the moonlight. "Figured it was your decision to make, your life, your choice, who's in it." He paused. "And selfishly, I was glad he was gone. Man who'd leave you and that baby doesn't deserve either of you." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. "I was afraid to tell people the truth, afraid they'd think less of me." "Anyone who'd think less of you for being left by a coward isn't worth your concern," Tucker said firmly. "You've built a life here through your own strength and determination. That's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." His words washed over her like a benediction, healing wounds she hadn't realized were still raw. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding." The boarding house came into view, its windows glowing with welcoming light. Tucker drew the sleigh to a stop and helped Nora down, careful not to disturb the sleeping Emma. His hands lingered at her waist, strong and steady. "Nora," he said, his voice low and serious, "I'd like your permission to call on you properly. Not just stopping by with excuses about checking on Emma or bringing eggs, but actually courting you if you'd allow it." Nora's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "Tucker, I'm still legally married. Even if Charles abandoned us, even if he never comes back, I know," he interrupted gently. "And I respect that. I'm not asking for promises you can't give, just a chance to show you what kind of man I am, what kind of life we might build if circumstances ever allow it." The hope in his eyes was unmistakable, and Nora found it mirrored in her own heart. She thought of Charles, who had promised everything and delivered nothing, and of Tucker, who promised nothing but delivered everything that mattered. "Yes," she said simply, "I'd like that very much." His smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss that was both chaste and profoundly intimate. "Merry Christmas, Nora," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Tucker," she replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible it could fit within her chest. As she carried Emma inside, Nora felt lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. The future was uncertain. Charles might return or send for a divorce or simply remain vanished. But for the first time since that dust-filled afternoon when she'd watched the stagecoach disappear, Nora felt hope blooming like a winter rose in her heart. The next few months passed in a gentle rhythm of work and quiet courtship. True to his word, Tucker began calling on Nora properly Sunday afternoons spent in the boarding house parlor, occasional drives in the sleigh while Ida watched Emma. Small gifts that showed he'd been paying attention to her likes and needs. With each passing week, Nora felt herself opening more to the possibility of a future with this quiet, steady man. Tucker was patient, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but his feelings were clear in the way his eyes followed her, the gentle brush of his hand against hers, the care he took with Emma. Emma, for her part, blossomed under Tucker's attention. By February, she was sitting up on her own and babbling constantly. By March, she was attempting to crawl, much to Nora's dismay and Tucker's amusement. "She's going to be riding before she walks," he predicted as Emma scooted across the parlor floor toward him one Sunday afternoon. "Got that determined look about her. Like her mother," Ida commented from her rocking chair by the fire, not looking up from her knitting. Tucker grinned. "Exactly like her mother." Spring came slowly to Timber Creek, the snow reluctantly giving way to mud, then to the first tentative green shoots. The days lengthened, bringing warmer temperatures and new energy to the town. In April, Nora received a letter forwarded from her parents in Pennsylvania. Her hands trembled as she recognized Charles's handwriting on the envelope. She waited until Emma was napping before opening it, steeling herself for whatever it might contain. The letter was brief and impersonal. Charles was in Montana, had found some success in the goldfields. He wouldn't be returning. He suggested a divorce would be best for all concerned and had initiated proceedings on his end. He hoped she and the child were well, no apology, no real explanation, just a formal ending to what had been, in retrospect, a mistake from the beginning. Nora sat for a long time after reading it, the letter limp in her hands. She had expected to feel something, anger, perhaps, or grief for what might have been. Instead, she felt only relief, as if a weight she'd grown accustomed to carrying had suddenly been lifted. When Tucker called that Sunday, she showed him the letter without comment. He read it carefully, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" he asked when he'd finished, setting the letter aside. Nora considered the question. "Yes," she said, realizing it was true. "I think I've been waiting for this in a way. Closure, I suppose." Tucker nodded, his eyes serious. "And how do you feel about what he's proposing, the divorce?" "Relieved," Nora admitted. "Is that terrible of me, to be glad my marriage is ending?" "No," Tucker said firmly. It ended the day he left you and Emma by the side of the road. This is just making it official." Nora looked at him then, really looked at him, at the strength and kindness in his face, the steadiness of his blue eyes, the hands that had lifted her and Emma from the dust without a word and had been supporting them in various ways ever since. "Tucker," she said softly. "When the divorce is final," he reached for her hand, enfolding it in his much larger one. "I'll be here," he promised, "however long it takes." The divorce process was lengthy but straightforward. By early summer, Nora received confirmation that it had been granted. She was, legally and officially, a free woman. The news spread quickly through Timber Creek's efficient gossip network. To Nora's surprise and relief, the reaction was largely supportive. It seemed Ida had been quietly setting the record straight about Charles's abandonment for months, ensuring that when the truth emerged fully, Nora would face understanding rather than censure. On a perfect June evening, with the sun casting long golden light across the rolling hills surrounding Timber Creek, Tucker took Nora for a drive. Emma, now a robust 10-month-old, stayed with Ida, who shooed them off with a knowing smile. Tucker drove beyond the town limits, following the creek upstream to a small meadow ablaze with wildflowers. Here he stopped the buggy, helping Nora down and leading her to a fallen log beside the water. "I wanted privacy for this conversation," he explained as they sat, the creek's gentle murmur providing a soothing backdrop. Nora's heart quickened. She had suspected what this outing might be about, had been both anticipating and fearing it in equal measure. Tucker took her hands in his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "Nora, I've been thinking about what to say to you for months now, how to tell you what's in my heart, but I've never been good with fancy words." "You don't need fancy words with me," Nora assured him, squeezing his hands. He smiled slightly. "Maybe not, but you deserve them all the same." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Nora, have since that first day, I think, though it took me longer to recognize it. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you are with Emma, the way you've built a life here through sheer will and hard work." Tears filled Nora's eyes, but she didn't interrupt. "I know you've had reason to distrust men's promises," Tucker continued. "So I won't make grand ones, just this. I'll be there every day doing my best by you and Emma. I'll work hard, I'll be honest. I'll never leave you to face hardship alone." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band set with a modest diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Nora Matthews, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Nora looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this man who had lifted her and Emma from the dust of abandonment and shown them what real love looked like. The answer was as clear as the summer sky above them. "Yes," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes, Tucker Ward, I will marry you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her to him, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that made Nora's heart race and her body warm. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you won't regret this," he whispered. "I know," Nora replied simply. And she did know, with a certainty that filled her entire being. They were married on a bright August morning in Timber Creek's small church. Emma, dressed in white and clutching her wooden horse, served as their only attendant, carried down the aisle by Ida, who wept openly throughout the ceremony. The Taylors attended, of course, Margaret beaming with satisfaction at her successful matchmaking. Dr. Wilson was there, and Mr. Peterson from the general store, and nearly everyone else from town. Even Dr. Preston had ridden in from Laramie, remembering the desperate night ride that had brought Tucker to his door months earlier. Nora wore a new dress of pale blue silk, a gift from the Taylor family, and carried wildflowers gathered that morning. Tucker, in a new black suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Tucker kissed her with a restrained passion that promised more later, when they were alone. The celebration afterward at the boarding house was joyous, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Emma was passed from lap to lap, showered with affection and treats, until she finally fell asleep in Margaret Taylor's arms, exhausted from the excitement. As the party wound down, Tucker led Nora outside to where his buggy waited, decorated with ribbons and flowers by the Taylor children. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Ward?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion and anticipation. Home. Not the boarding house where she'd spent the past 10 months, but the small house Tucker had been building on land adjoining the Taylor ranch, their house, where they would live and raise Emma and perhaps other children, God willing. "Yes," Nora said, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Take us home, Tucker." He lifted her into the buggy, then returned for Emma, who barely stirred as he settled her in Nora's arms. The guests gathered on the porch, calling good wishes and tossing flower petals as Tucker climbed up beside his new family and took the reins. As they drove away from town toward their new life, Nora looked back once at the faces of those who had become her community, her support, her friends. Then she turned to her husband, a word that now filled her with joy rather than pain, and smiled. "I never thought I'd be happy again that day you found us," she said softly. "Never imagined I could feel this kind of joy." Tucker's hand found hers, his grip warm and secure. "That day I found you was the luckiest of my life," he replied, "even if I didn't know it yet." Emma stirred between them, her small hand clutching at Nora's dress in her sleep. Tucker looked down at her with such tenderness that Nora's heart constricted. "She'll never remember him," he said, his voice low, "but she'll know what it is to be loved by a father." "Yes, she will," Nora agreed, blinking back tears of gratitude. "The very best kind." The road ahead stretched before them, winding through the Wyoming countryside toward the home they would build together. The future, once so frightening and uncertain, now seemed full of promise. Nora leaned her head against Tucker's shoulder, contentment washing over her. From abandonment to belonging, from despair to hope, from loneliness to love, the journey had been hard, but the destination was everything she could have wished for and more. As if reading her thoughts, Tucker pressed a kiss to her hair. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "The best is yet to come." And as their house came into view, a lantern burning welcomingly in the window, Nora knew with absolute certainty that he was right. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the ranch yard as Nora hung laundry on the line, pausing to watch Emma and 3-year-old James chase each other around the oak tree. Their laughter carried on the warm breeze, mingling with the distant sound of Tucker's voice as he worked with a new colt in the corral. 5 years had passed since that fateful day when Charles had abandoned them by the side of the road. 5 years since Tucker had lifted them both from the dust without a word, changing all their lives forever. The ranch was thriving. Tucker's reputation as a horse trainer had spread throughout the territory, bringing clients from as far away as Denver. The small house he'd built for them had expanded to accommodate their growing family, with a wide porch where they gathered on summer evenings to watch the sunset. Emma, now 5.5, was the spitting image of Nora except for her dark eyes. She had no memory of Charles, knew only that Tucker was her papa and had been since before she could remember. James, born 2 years after their marriage, had Tucker's blue eyes and quiet determination, and now there would be another. Nora placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her touch. Just 3 more months until their family would grow again. "Mama, look what I found," Emma called, running toward her with something clutched in her small hands. She opened them carefully to reveal a perfect blue butterfly, resting briefly before fluttering away toward the wildflowers that bordered the yard. "It's beautiful," Nora said, smoothing her daughter's sun-warmed hair. "Just like you." "Papa says I'm smart like you," Emma replied with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "Papa is a very wise man," Nora agreed, smiling as she watched Tucker approaching from the corral, James having abandoned his sister to run to his father. Tucker swung the boy up onto his shoulders with practiced ease, his face tilted up to say something that made James giggle uncontrollably. The sight of them together, this strong, gentle man and the son who adored him, filled Nora's heart with quiet joy. When they reached her, Tucker set James down and pulled Nora into a brief embrace, his hand lingering on her rounded belly. "How are my girls doing today?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "We're fine," Nora assured him, covering his hand with her own. "Though your daughter is practicing her kicks like she's planning to be a dancer." Tucker grinned. "Takes after her mama, strongest woman I know." Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Nora and Tucker sat on the porch swing, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in the comfortable intimacy of long married love. "Do you ever think about it?" Tucker asked quietly. "That day by the road," Nora considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret anymore, just acknowledgement, I suppose, of how life can change in an instant." Tucker's arm tightened around her. "I think about it too, about how close I came to riding past. I'd been up since dawn, was thinking only of getting back to the ranch, almost didn't stop." The thought sent a chill through Nora despite the warm evening. "But you did stop." "Best decision I ever made," Tucker said simply. "Saving you and Emma, that was really saving myself." Nora turned her face up to his, still moved by the love she saw in his eyes after all these years. "We saved each other, I think." His kiss was gentle, familiar yet still thrilling, a promise renewed daily in the life they'd built together. Inside the house, James called out in his sleep. They both paused, listening, but the sound wasn't repeated. "I'll check on him," Tucker said, rising and stretching before heading inside. Nora remained on the porch a moment longer, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palm. The vast Wyoming sky stretched above her, stars scattered like diamonds on velvet. She thought of all the twists and turns that had brought her here, the heartbreak that had led to joy, the abandonment that had led to the truest love she'd ever known. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost divinely orchestrated. When Tucker returned, he held out his hand to help her up. "Children are sleeping peacefully," he reported. "Time for us to do the same, I think." Nora took his hand as she had that first day when he'd lifted her from the dust, as she had at their wedding, as she had countless times in the years between and since. Each time a choice, a renewal of trust, a silent affirmation. As they walked inside together, closing the door on the vast night, Nora sent a silent thanks to whatever twist of fate had placed Tucker Ward on that road on that particular afternoon. The road that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning, the first step on a journey more beautiful than she could have imagined. That journey continued, day by day, moment by moment, in the home and the life they'd built together, the cowboy who had lifted them both without a word, the woman who had found the courage to trust again, and the family they had created from the ashes of abandonment. It was, Nora reflected as Tucker's arm circled her waist, exactly as he had promised on their wedding day. The best was still unfolding, each day bringing new joys, new challenges, new opportunities to love. And that, she knew with bone-deep certainty, would never change.